Welcome, everybody, to the 2021 fifth annual Building Solutions HPC retreat. This is day 2, session 1. A couple of housekeeping items as a reminder to ensure your mic is muted during the presentation. If you have a question, place it in the chat and we will address it within the time allotted. If you do have a question for the presenter, please, and during the presentation, raise your hand, or you're welcome to unmute yourself and ask away. But for the most part, just put the question in the chat, and we'll address it. And a reminder: all presentations are being recorded and will be uploaded to our YouTube channel. Today we have Russ Gout with ESEI. And Russ, I think you and Building Solutions have been partners or been consultants together for almost 30 years. Is that correct?
That's correct, yeah.
So Russ Gout is the president of Ecosystems Environmental and leads a team of highly trained and licensed technical personnel that meet current industry guidelines, industry standards, and applicable regulatory requirements. He received his Bachelor of Science in Industrial Technology from the University of Northern Iowa and his Master of Science in Hazardous and Waste Management from Southern Methodist University. The topic today is Environmental Standards and Practices for Schools, presented by Russ Gout. Russ, I give you the floor.
All right, thank you, Bill. So I think just overall point of discussion here, I think the vast majority of what we're going to be talking about is asbestos. I think that's what is most concerning to managers, local education agencies for management practices, is the asbestos building materials during their Ahera programs and renovations. But we can also touch base on lead-based paint and mold issues, indoor air quality issues, and we'll kind of address those in the question and answers portion of it. And like Bill said, I mean, feel free to ask questions anytime. I kind of shoot from the hip. I really don't have a set script that I go by. So I'm basically going to start off with what we're talking about, what the asbestos building materials are, how they're used, and then get into the regulations. So asbestos containing building materials have been around for several decades, specifically starting in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and getting into the 70s. And manufacturers have put asbestos in building products to help durability, fireproofing, insulation. There's no insulation material that's better than asbestos for boilers and hot water pipes and fittings. If anybody has seen the difference between the old 9x9 asbestos floor tiles and the new 12x12 floor tiles that they manufacture now without asbestos in it, you can go into a building school that was built in the 1950s, and the floor tile, when it gets waxed and conditioned, looks put in yesterday. And two new 12x12 without the asbestos, you have to replace it every dozen years or so. It just doesn't keep up with the wear and tear of the asbestos tiles. Fireproofing materials, asbestos fibers don't burn. They're not chemically, they don't get etched by chemicals. You use them in fireproofing in your steel buildings, countertops in your laboratories, in your science laboratories. So it's a very durable building material, and that's why it was used so prevalent back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And in the 70s is when it came to light publicly that asbestos with all its good qualities, is also a carcinogen. So it has a number of asbestos-related illnesses, and so the charge was to manage it in buildings to keep the airborne hazards at minimum, and a big concentration was put into schools because our children are still their systems, their body systems are still developing, and they're more susceptible to the effects of long-term, high-exposure asbestos environments. So that's kind of the spiel on what asbestos building materials are, where they were used, why they were used, and so now we're getting to how does that affect us in your school properties. Back in the early 70s, the EPA came up with their NESHAPs, their first NESHAPs regulations. That's National Emission Standards for Hazardous Air Pollutants. I should say they came up with their first asbestos NESHAPs. There's NESHAPs standards for all different types of air pollutants, but the first asbestos NESHAPs came about in the 1970s. It was very basic, more of an awareness than anything else. And it identified the concern and really wanted to make sure that materials weren't disturbed to create airborne emissions, and that if you have to deal with the asbestos materials, that be done in a wet fashion. From there, the next major standard, and the one that we're going to talk about most today, is the Ahera Standard. And that is that's an EPA standard, the Asbestos Hazard Emergency Response Act, and that was promulgated back in 1986 under the Reagan administration. And that basically is our building block for regulations that concern asbestos in our schools, and that's K through 12, public, private. Everything except for for-profit. Private for-profit does not fall under the regulation, but charter schools, school districts, and anything public or district-wise, K through 12 falls under the Ahera regulation. And what the regulation says that you, as a local education agency or the owner of the school, what we call the LEA. The LEA is responsible for managing the asbestos on your property to make sure that your students and staff are not exposed to asbestos hazards. And the first requirement was that in 1986, you were supposed to start an asbestos survey and management plan program. And management programs were all due in 87. And that's why you see so many of the schools that have been around for decades, their original management plans were 1987, 1988 dates. And the design around that was to go out and sample any building materials that are suspect of being asbestos. And there's a whole laundry list of different type of building materials to test for. And once you find that you have asbestos materials in your building, on your property, then you put it into a management plan so you can effectively manage it in place and also address it if and when the need comes to disturb the materials during renovations. And one of the biggest problems we have with the Ahera surveys and management plans, especially the ones that were done back in the 80s when the regulations first came out, are inspectors and management planners didn't know what they were doing. They didn't know what to sample for. They didn't know what materials to look for. And the regulators that we submitted these programs to by law, they didn't know what to check for, and they didn't know either. So almost every original Ahera management plan from the 80s is non-complete. I mean, there's just building materials that just weren't sampled, presumptions that were made erroneously, and for the most part, if you've been managing your schools under the Ahera program since then, it's probably caught up to where additional materials have been sampled, and and the management plan has been brought back out in line. But that's something that you just need to look at your management plan and see if everything's been sampled properly in accordance with the regulations. And the other aspects of the management plan go into managing the materials in place. Before when the Ahera management plan was regulated, that was well before any state regulations. There was no licensing requirements. There were certifications. The Ahera inspectors and management planners had to go through training classes, but there were no state regulations per se. And the state regulations is when the licensing came in. And so your original management plans were most likely performed by certified inspectors and management plan, but not necessarily licensed inspectors and management plans from your state regulatory agencies. And so when the state agencies came in, those were most likely the agencies that were relegated to where you were to then update and send your management plans to for review. For instance, here in Texas, the management plans were meant to send to at that time the Texas Department of Health. After that, there is no requirement. There is no regulatory requirement to submit any updates or anything like that. It's just that the state then knows, or the enforcement agency then knows that you've got it, and they can come out and do assessments, periodic inspections to make sure that you're keeping up with the management plan. One big aspect of the management plan is an operation and maintenance program. And again, that was geared toward managing small scale, short duration, incidental emergencies, walking into a mechanical room and some pipe installations on the ground, walking into a classroom and some floor tile has popped up, how to manage that in-house properly and get it documented properly until a larger scale renovation can take care of it. And again, these original management plans and O&M programs were meant to be done in-house because there wasn't the state agencies for licensing and stuff. Custodial staff did the cleanup, did the response for these O&M programs. And so in the Ahera program and in your management plan and your O&M program, there are training requirements for different classes of asbestos response. And the custodial, the O&M, has certain training requirements for them to go in and clean up asbestos debris or damage, or go remove a small amount so that you can take care of other maintenance activities. If you've got asbestos pipe insulation in a mechanical room and you've got to replace a valve, they come in there, they can and re-insulated. Well, in the early 90s, most states started coming up with their state regulations, which required licensing. And at that point, that's the point where all activities, including operation and maintenance, started going out of house. And in the state of Texas, you can no longer do the operation and maintenance with your custodial staff or with your maintenance staff unless you are licensed as a asbestos O&M contractor. And there's just a lot of liability, there's equipment, there's licensing you have to keep up with. And other than the very large districts, municipal districts, I don't really know that anybody has in-house staff or in-house O&M capabilities anymore. So the O&M programs have more so gone to, hey, who do you contact in case you have a small scale, short duration O&M or an emergency cleanup that you have to do? Who's your contact that can get the proper licensed people in to take care of the response activity? So then you get the O&M. So that kind of touches base on the O&M activity. The other is the larger scale response actions. And the management plan, as well as the Ahera regulation, spells out how you have to remediate or abate asbestos in a larger scale renovation. And again, most states have taken that aspect over with more stringent requirements, where you've got to use licensed consultants, licensed project managers, licensed air monitoring technicians, licensed abatement contractors, transporters. And they've even gone further in that you can't just go off of the original Ahera survey, because they weren't adequate. So anytime you do a renovation in your school property, you should have what we call a pre-renovation asbestos survey for that specific renovation project. And you can use the data that has been collected in the original survey, but a licensed consultant inspector needs to analyze that Ahera management plan and take supplemental samples as necessary to make sure that every building material that's going to be renovated or disturbed during the renovation is properly tested, analyzed, and determined whether it's asbestos-containing material. And that goes for building materials that were put in when the building was first built in the 60s and 70s, or the building was first built in the 80s or 90s. It was built after the Ahera regulation. It also includes areas that were renovated 5 years ago. If you've got an office area that was renovated 5 years ago and you've got a new master plan and you've got to renovate that office again, well, you've got to have that material tested. For the Ahera management plan, you don't have to have it tested right away, because you can get a letter from the architect stating that there were no asbestos materials placed into the material. But when you go into the renovations, the regulations step up a little bit more. And instead of just an architect saying, to the best of my knowledge, no asbestos was specified, no asbestos was put into these building materials, the state regulations will say that you need an architect that will stamp and certify that there is no asbestos in these building materials. And I don't know of any architect that will do that. And so in lieu of that, you've got to have the materials tested. And there's no date cutoff or anything in that manner, to where if this was built after 2010, I don't have to do the testing. You do have to do the testing. You do have to do the sampling to document that it's not asbestos-containing materials. And if you do have a renovation where you've got a renovation that does include asbestos-containing materials, then you've got to hire a licensed consultant to put together a project design and bring in licensed contractors to provide you pricing for asbestos abatement. And there's a lot of different guidelines and requirements that go into having to design and remove asbestos properly prior to regular demolition or build back that could disturb the materials. One of the a few of the key document or items of asbestos abatement project are isolation. You've got to isolate the work area from other areas of the building. Everything's got to be done under negative pressure. You have to create a negative pressure environment so that if your isolation should happen to breach, air will be coming into the work area instead of the possible contaminated air going out into the non-work areas. The negative pressure, the air that comes out of the work areas, has to be filtered with HEPA filtration. The workers have to have proper PPE, suits and respirators and other protective clothing. Everything has to, in that work area, has to come in and out of decontamination chambers and load-out chambers that will decontaminate the personnel and the waste materials properly. And then before the work area is completed and the containment is brought down for other renovation tasks, the work area has to be cleared with air sampling. And in school buildings, unless it's a small-scale, short-duration project, an O&M project, in school buildings, the clearance has to be what we call transmission electron microscopy, TEM analysis. And that's written into the Ahera regulation, and there's all the other requirements in there. But it's an analysis that they can't do on site. they've got to take it to an outside laboratory, send it to an outside laboratory where they do the analysis and they report the results back to the project for clearance teardown. The reason for the TEM, when we do an abatement project, whether it's in a school or in another public building or even an ESHAPS project, most of the analysis that gets done is under polarized light, phase contrast microscopy, PCM, and that's where the on-site project manager or technician can actually look at a microscope that they've got set up or sent to an outside laboratory, but it's run under a PCM analysis, which is a light microscope, and there's certain counting criterias, but you're limited to the limits of an optical microscope, a light microscope, and the methods for analysis under PCM are not specific for asbestos. So any other fibers that are encountered in that project, whether it be carpet fibers, fiberglass, or mineral wool, any other fibers that could be in the air, if they meet the counting criteria, we have to count them as fibers toward our criteria or clearance criteria. For the transmission electron microscope, obviously they can analyze those fibers at a much smaller consistency, and so they can detect much smaller fibers, and it is very specific for asbestos fibers. So it'll get rid of all the interfering fibers, but it will specifically tell you whether or not you've got asbestos fibers that are airborne in your work area. And that's what is performed for clearances. It's not performed for every sampling because it's awfully expensive, and you can't do that for every sample that you collect on a abatement project. So that's where we do the PCM to make sure that the overall fiber concentration, airborne quality is kept in check. So that's the general requirements of an actual abatement project. Going back to the Ahera regulation, whether it's O&M, a survey that's been done, or a response action, a large-scale abatement, all these are referred to as response actions, and you have to document that in your management plan. Your management plan is a working document. It's not to be developed in 1986 and put on a shelf and never touched again. You've got a lot of things you have to do on a regular basis to keep that up. And some of the documentation requirement is the response actions, the O&M activities that take place, the surveys that you have done, and the abatement activities that you have done. And there's places in your management plan to record all that. Other aspects of the asbestos management plan is you have to notify your staff and guardians of your parents, guardians of your students on an annual basis that you fall under the jurisdiction of the Ahera management plan, and you've got the documents that they can come by and review if necessary. Can take place in several different ways. Back in the day when it first started, it was put out in the handbook that was printed and given to every family, or even put out in a special brochure. Nowadays, it's typically digital, so it's either emailed out to the families or posted on the school's website. So there's lots of different ways that you can fulfill that obligation of notifying your parents and staff, but that is something that you need to make sure that that's done at least on an annual basis. Any staff, maintenance or custodial staff that is working in an area where asbestos could be disturbed has to have what we call the awareness training. It's a 2-hour awareness training. I know several schools that are probably on this session here that we do, get with them every 2 years and do a 2-hour awareness training for their maintenance custodial people who go into mechanical rooms or go into the areas where their job is to clean or to do routine maintenance on materials that could obtain contain asbestos. And this training is not to teach them how to remove it, how to clean it up or anything. It's just how to observe and see if there's disturbance, where then you can go back to your program manager and say, hey, we've got some disturbance here that needs to be addressed. So that's the, now that everything's gone to a licensing and outsourced and nobody does asbestos O&M in-house anymore, that's the requirement for the training for LEAs, is to make sure your custodial and maintenance staff are trained. The only other training requirement is for the designated person. For your LEA and this management plan, you have to have a designated person assigned to manage your asbestos. And that person does have to have a training on how to manage that properly. And it's not really specific to amount of hours. It's more so line items. And most of the clients that where they change designated persons or need to have that training, I send them to a local training provider here in the Dallas-Fort Worth area that has a session specifically for Ahera or managing asbestos in place. And it's, I think, a 6 or an 8 hour training that fulfills the requirements of the designated person for your Ahera program. So we've got record keeping of response actions. We've got the training of the staff. We've got notification requirements to the parents and staff. And you've also got the periodic surveillance and re-inspections. So every 6 months, the LEA, designated person or somebody that you designate on your staff, needs to do a periodic surveillance. And that's your management plan is going to have a list of all the identified asbestos-containing materials on your campus. And you've got to go through every 6 months and observe and do a quality check, a condition check on these materials to make sure that they're not damaged. And if they are damaged, then you've got to record it and take the next step to get them repaired. So that's stuff that's done in-house every 6 months. And then every 3 years, you've got to retain the services of a asbestos consultant to come in and do a re-inspection. And again, that is taking your list of asbestos materials and doing a assessment on it to make sure that they are still in good condition, remaining good condition and non-friable. Now, the loophole or a ticker on that is there's no requirement to sample those materials that were missed in your original management plan. So the 3-year reinspection may or may not include materials that haven't been sampled. The only requirement is that you assess and do a reinspection on those materials that have been identified. Most schools realize the lack there and have most likely gone back and sampled materials that were not originally picked up. But if you have not done that, you might want to think about having somebody look at your Ahera management survey and any subsequent surveys and doing a little bit more comprehensive to make sure anything that's in the building has been sampled properly. That's just good maintenance practices and good practice for future renovations. So that is my spiel on Aheras in schools, the Ahera regulation. Are there any questions at this point on anything with the Ahera regulation?
If anybody has any questions, you're welcome to unmute yourself and ask.
I figured Kevin Polson would have a question.
You're right. Yeah. You're as everyone hears me say, I just love what you do. Because I've said that about the space analysis and everything else that we learn. Just the facilities management industry is fascinating. my experience, you and I go a long ways back in the institutions that I served in environmental uh, work, and I've not found this to be a difficult thing to do at all. If you just follow the steps and do what you need to do, it costs some money, but in the grand scheme of things of what we deal with, it's not expensive. And the asbestos uh, um, operations or the management plan is a very simple thing to keep up. It's very useful, especially if you have um, uh, a major flood or tornado damage or something like that. That's the first thing you want to grab is where's the asbestos. You're in a position there where the insurance company is going to pay to evade it. And so if you still have it in place, you can incorporate the things into your claims and all that. So it's very, very useful to have an asbestos operation management plan. And I've noticed here as I have exposure to more and more schools, I've never been to a school that didn't ultimately end up with an asbestos management plan because I saw the benefit of it. But as I get access to more and more schools, I'm seeing a lot of schools that do not have that, and it's alarming to me that they are not embracing that. What kind of uh, what kind of concerns should a school have if they don't have that in place?
Well, so the original Ahera regulation had a date. I don't know the date off the top of my head. I think it was 1987, and then it was extended to 1988. But there's a date that every school in the country had to have this filed by, and since then, obviously, we've had thousands of campuses that were built. New schools added, new districts added, new charter schools added that may have been built in the 1990s and the 2000s and the 2001s. And obviously that was before the Ahera regulation. And a lot of them, since they didn't have that original management plan from back then, had no idea what's going on. So, but the regulation does state that if you have a new building or if you have a new campus or if you are even doing regulations, you've got to prepare a asbestos survey and management plan. We get probably 5 or 6 calls every year of a school that is going through certifications. And one of the checklists on a lot of these certification programs is an asbestos management plan. And so we've got to go out and do a management plan that on a campus that might have 3 buildings that was built in 2005. And there's a requirement that you've got to have that, whether you think there's asbestos or not, whatever the date is, you've got to have that management plan. And that management plan might not be anything more than the regulatory statutes, kind of an outline, and then letters from the architect saying, to the best of our ability, these 3 schools that were built in 2005 don't contain asbestos. And that's good for your Ahera management plan. But what Kevin was alluding to is, over and above that, you've got the state regulations. And if you've got an incident where you've got damage that has to be repaired, one of the first things you've got to prove to a state or your remediation contractor or your build back contractor is that there is no asbestos in those building materials, because they won't disturb it unless you can tell them that it's asbestos. So that's where you go over and above the Ahera regulation and get into the state regulations of having to have your buildings tested. As Kevin was saying, just having that knowledge puts you in an action mode as opposed to a reaction mode. One of the aspects that we were going to hit on next is the damage from storms or emergencies, and dealing with damaged building materials that have asbestos. Your response and your requirement for the remediation is much different. You have, for the cleanup and the tear down and the flood cuts or the removal of the damaged material has to be done by a licensed contractor as opposed to just a remediation contractor. And the other thing you've got to really study is, okay, so that maybe you've got a flood cut. The bottom of the wallboard system's got have water damage, and you got to remove those before mold kicks in. Well, how is that wall tied into the rest of the building, and how is the bottom of the wall tied into what's the finishes on it? And a lot of times, I think what Kevin was kind of gearing toward also, a lot of times, if you've got an asbestos wall system, you're going to have to remove more of that wall system because it's got asbestos in it than you would a newer wall system where you could just do a flood cut and patch it back, because you're going to have issues with building back new building systems if you're building back into systems that weren't damaged but still contain asbestos. You've got limitations of what you can do to patch that material back in. And wall coverings. You can't just pull wall coverings, whether it be a lat board or paneling or FRP or something, off of an asbestos-containing wall system and do the flood cut. Pulling that material off of that wall system is going to disturb the asbestos behind it, and so the whole remediation, it adds a lot more potential materials that have to be addressed during during emergency responses. And your insurance companies, for the most part, realize that, but they just have to be told. You have to know that so that you can tell them and put that into your claim activity.
Russ, what are the ramifications to a school if they do not have a plan in place, if they don't have any type of record in place? What's the ramification? Are there penalties? There's liability? Are there fines? What happens if a school doesn't have an Ahera management plan?
Okay. Well, the EPA can come out and inspect or assess your management plan at any time, and there are enforcement items that are published in the regulation. The vast majority of states, the EPA has contracted with the state regulatory agency to do the enforcement. I don't know where everybody's from. If there's, I'm going to talk about Texas, just because I know Texas better than anything else. But in the state of Texas, the EPA is given that authority to the Texas Department of State Health Services, and there is a employee in our region, different regions. There's 7 or 8 regions in Texas that will go out and do what they call an Ahera inspection, and they quite frankly target small schools. They pretty much figure that the bigger schools, this is something that they have designated people for. They've got projects all the time. They got a good place. I mean, that doesn't mean they don't go out. They visited my larger school districts too, but they really like to hit the smaller schools because they know that designated person for the Ahera management plan wears 20 different hats. And a lot of times the asbestos hat gets tossed in the corner and doesn't get kept up to date. And so the inspectors will come out and they'll take a look at your documents. If you've got a management plan and it's kept up to date, that's great. If you got a management plan that's not kept up to date, that's not so great. And if you don't have a management plan at all, that is not good at all. Now, again, my experience just in Texas and the regulatory people here is their goal is not to fine schools. They do not want to put an undue financial hardship on the schools, and especially the smaller schools. But they do want the regulations followed. So they will give you some really good leniency to get it kept, brought up to date. And so we get calls, like I said, 5 or 6 a year, where they got a visit from the state, and hey, we don't have a management plan. We need to put together a management plan, and we'll respond to the state agency and tell them, hey, we're working on it, and this is our plan. And they'll say, okay, get it done and submit it to us. And as long as you communicate with them, let them know what you're doing, and have a schedule to get yourself either an original management plan, or take your management plan that you haven't done anything for 20 years and get that up to speed. The regulatory people will will work with you and work you through until you get everything where it needs to be, and they'll issue you a letter saying you're now in compliance, and then you just need to make sure that you continue to stay in compliance and keep it up as you are meant to. The big enforcement is in the remediation activities, and that's more of a state enforcement and state regulations as the Ahera. The Ahera, they really want to work with you. They just want to protect the kids. They really want you to have that in, and they'll work. If you totally ignore them, then yeah, you've got enforcement issues that are written into the regulation, and they can come down on you. I have not experienced any of that. I just have not had experience with a LEA that just refuses to do the management plan. They'll get it to where it needs to be. The big violations, again, are with the state regulations, and that has to do with actual responses to asbestos materials and the response actions, the renovation activities. If you have a school and you're going in and you're knocking down all the walls and ceilings and pulling up all the floors in one of the wings of your school building, and you haven't done an asbestos survey, and you haven't, or even if you have an asbestos survey and you're just having your regular contractor remove it, and you don't follow the asbestos regulations that are published by the state, then you can get some really hefty fines. And every year in our refresher training, our training provider puts those up on the board because the state publishes them, and there's hundreds every month of violations of not just schools, but people who and companies that don't follow the regulations, and they get caught, and they're forced to pay the penalties. And the penalties are published in the regulatory documents, and they could be as high as $10,000 per day per violation. So they can add up if you are willfully not managing your property properly, or if one of the big things they want is just make sure you do the inspection. That's the biggest thing that can keep you out of trouble, is make sure you identify whether a building material is asbestos before you disturb it through renovations.
Fantastic. We have about 5 minutes left, Russ, but here's another question for you. How often do you need to refresh training for the person on site who does the 6-month inspection?
There is no training requirement for that person. The designated person for the school district, whether he or she does it themselves or has somebody in their maintenance, there is no training requirement for that person. Typically, that person will have a checklist of identified asbestos-containing materials that are on that property, and the checklist can be no more than is there damage? Yes or no. Is there any change in condition? Yes or no. And that's that 6 months inspection requirement. Then that 6 months inspection then goes to the designated person. The designated person looks at it and says, do I have a response action I have to take care of? And at that point, if everything's clean, no damage, no friable, nothing that needs to be cleaned up or renovated, then he files it, and they go on to the next 6 months. If he sees that something's been damaged and needs to take place, then that designated person, he or she has to take the responsibility of getting the proper people in there to get it clean. So the person who's doing the 6-month surveillances, there is no requirement for training or refresher training. Even the designated person, the person who's in charge of the management plan, as long as you have that initial training, there is no requirement for refresher training for that training requirements. The only caveat to that is if that designated person and that person who's doing the 6 months surveillance is part of your maintenance and custodial staff that gets the annual 2-hour awareness, they still have to abide by that.
All right, fantastic. One more question that came through, and then I'll give you you'll have a few minutes to wrap up, Russ. The question is, due to the disease's maturation period, are schools still the top priority?
My take on that is schools are still the top priority because you're dealing with kids. In my opinion, asbestos-related illnesses are soon to be a thing of the past, but that's only because it's being managed properly. The people who have got the asbestos-related illnesses now are the people who came down with the asbestos-related illnesses in the 70s and 80s are the people who put them in the buildings, in the 50s and 60s. The people who've got the asbestos-related illnesses now are the people who manage the building materials that did renovations. Back in the 70s, one of the biggest culprits of folks that are coming up with asbestosis now are people in the 70s that put in sheetrock, put in drywall. Back then, you put in drywall, you have to tape them embedded by hand, and there's a lot of sanding. And so those drywallers back in the 70s were working in a cloud of asbestos dust day in and day out, and that's why they've got asbestosis, because they're constantly breathing in high levels of asbestos fibers. Nowadays there's no asbestos in it, but also you got the tools that you just pull a trigger and go down, and it puts the mud in, it puts the tape in, and it smooths the mud, and there's no sanding. So construction methods has gotten better. Asbestos bans are in place. I mean, in 2002, the state of Texas again put in a regulation that before you can get a permit to go get a renovation or demolition permit, you have to show that you've done an asbestos survey. Well, in addition, on that Senate bill, in addition to doing that survey, they also put a statement in there that you can no longer put asbestos in a public building. So that is kind of in line of hopefully in the last 20 years, asbestos hasn't been put in building materials. The biggest exception to that we have found, and we found it in buildings that we've surveyed as old as 5 years ago, are mirror mastics. For some reason, the mastic that they use to glue those little black pucks that they use to glue mirrors into restrooms and gymnasiums and stuff like that, they've used mirror mastics well beyond the state requirement for not using them. So keep an eye on that. But get back to the actual question. I think schools are not ever going to be relaxed just basically because of the student exposure, potential for student exposure. They're the long-term exposure latency period for the asbestosis and the cancers and stuff. Those are for adults. There's case studies where children develop mesothelioma and the other cancer on a quicker latency period because their systems are developing faster. So the regulators, I don't think, are ever going to let their guard down on the schools.
Fantastic. I appreciate that. We have run out of time. So we are... Russ, it's always a pleasure. You're extremely, extremely knowledgeable in this industry, and it's been a pleasure having you as a business partner for so many years. And thank you for being here with us. Thank you, everyone, for all your questions. Our next session, the campus security strategies for today and tomorrow, will be coming up in just 9 minutes. I want to thank everybody for participating here, and we'll see you at the next session. Thanks, everybody, for being here.
All right. Thank you.